Now, good morning, everybody. It is a pleasure. I'm Mark Zimmet. When this conference concept came up, for Mark and I to go back and forth on some of the trends we're seeing with PDPM, all I can say is that they are pretty interesting, I think, to say the least. So the concept here today is not to go over PDPM 101 by any stretch of the imagination. It is to share some of the trends, where we're going, what it means, what we think it means, and certainly from the national perspective. When I had to think of a title for this session, if this works, here we go. We call the PDPM and cognitive dissonance, which basically means in the field of psychology, the experience of stress that occurs when a person holds two or more contradictory beliefs and they kind of go against each other. So in the field of skilled nursing, we're going to call this the stress that a SNF operator feels to, number one, capture every dollar they're entitled to, every single dollar. But overall, we're facing an issue of budget neutrality. We don't know where the numbers come out. And it creates some interesting incentives. Like any new system, PDPM is imperfect. It is a dramatic improvement in every sense of the word relative to the RUGS 4 program, which was, statistically speaking, possibly the worst payment system in terms of predicting how much cost is explained by the different RUGS score. So we have these different incentives, and we've analyzed hundreds of thousands of UBs already from over 1,000 facilities for the first few months. And while the overall impact is different, we had a couple challenges. Number one, this is not RUGS 4. If I ask anybody from the same county what your average rate is, I don't even have to ask you. I could probably tell you within 5% what the average rate is. You know, you're 60% ultra high, this and that. It is a very easy measure of performance. PDPM doesn't work that way because of the variable day weight adjustment. The shorter the stays, the higher the average length. The shorter the average length of stay, the higher the per diem rate. So everything has consequences, and every reimbursement change alters the way the industry goes about managing documentation, strategy, and I want to touch a little bit about some of the unintended consequences that we're seeing with PDPM as well. So, getting right into it, I will preface this by saying that PDPM is really just one component of an inconsistent, inequitable, and unsustainable SNF revenue delivery system. We're talking big picture here. We have Medicare as our most important payer, but it is shrinking, invariably. Different parts of the country are very different. I like to say we don't have a national industry. Things are so different in various states, even among county lines. When we get into the performance and position, you're talking about things like Medicare Advantage penetration, alternative payment models, the state regs. I mean, we're dealing with a system where federal regulations are superimposed on very different state requirements. And it doesn't necessarily come out even. And the average Medicare rate is no longer a measure of how well we're managing the program. You can have everything captured relative to your neighbor, the same exact patient population, and the rate can be $200 a day difference because of the day waiting. So all these measures of performance need to be taken in context when we see how somebody's doing and where they started. So the question I get asked most is, how am I doing relative to everybody else? What's my average rate compared to everybody else? It's an impossible question to answer. I mean, I can give you a nominal figure, but what's your length of stay? You know, what other pressures are you experiencing that maybe your neighbors aren't? And the best story I had was I spoke to a panel. I spoke on a panel of accountable care organizations and SNF members. And an argument ensued that the ACO was upset that, I should say the SNF was upset that the ACO had forced down average length of stay by 50%, from 28 days to 16 days or something like that. The ACO countered, well, under PDPM, your rate went up $200 a day. The rate went up because length of stay went down. So a big part of explaining all these challenges and where the numbers fall out is the context of a facility-specific situation. Not necessarily the capture, not necessarily the acuity. So when we see something like this, which is one of my favorite slides that are reused, Pittsburgh versus West Virginia. Pittsburgh versus West Virginia. Pittsburgh has a lot of alternative payment models. ACOs, bundled, and West Virginia has very few. And when you look at the average standardized Medicare post-acute care spend between Pittsburgh and over the border in West Virginia, Pittsburgh's down 19% in post-acute care spend, while West Virginia is up 12%. That is a significant difference that impacts the entire revenue cycle. So the Medicare changes mean a lot more in different parts of the country. By the same token, we have Medicare Advantage, which even among states across county lines varies so much that it is cannibalizing our fee-for-service population with episodic revenue for the SNF at 50% in some places. So we are comparing the impact of a federal system against 50 different state programs, and it becomes a near impossibility. So for numbers today, what we did is we had to come up with a standardized measure of performance, compare apples to apples. So the numbers that I'll put on the screen that I found most interesting is that we assumed everybody had an average wage index of 1.0. Everybody's even. And we assumed the average rate was the rate associated with a 25-day length of stay to neutralize it. Because anybody with a 90-day average length of stay versus anybody with a 9-day average length of stay is just not comparable. So it's a little bit difficult to follow, but it is the best way we could figure out to compare apples to apples on the effect of the average rate on a skilled nursing facility. So when we break down the standardized rates, this is where it starts getting interesting to see how facilities are performing. We have the 4 different components. We're not going to count the non-case mix adjusted. It's a question of variability. I've said since day one the PDPM is a far superior system, but in terms of tweaks and in terms of where the incentives are, I think the biggest irony is right here. On the PT-OT component, this is from almost 900 facilities in our database that are highly diverse. They are not for-profit New York providers downstate. They are becoming more and more representative of the nation as a whole. So we take a look at October, November, and December. And before anybody says anything, we started with October 2nd admissions. We wanted to get rid of that distortion from October. That's not fair. So this really is an apples-to-apples comparison and see how things moved. So the PT-OT average rate among those 3 months changed $1. There's no creep there. There's no variability in the PT-OT component. And that's just a fact of the system. And I think probably that is the number one area of allocation that needs to be corrected. I think, Mark, what are your thoughts on that, on the PT-OT? There's just no variability. So we wanted to see where the variability was. Now, you'll see that 219. You should see that, yeah. There's a $219.72 What we did there is compared RUGS 4 therapy payment, increase for market basket index, again, apples to apples. So we have PDPM paying the PT and OT plus speech component at $220 a day. That's what Medicare is paying on average for PT, OT, and speech. The RUGS 4 updated, look what they paid for very high, 179, 261, the therapy component when we really break it down. So the irony here is that in one sense, PDPM is perpetuating the very concept in reverse that RUGS 4 was trying to, they were trying to eliminate from RUGS 4. So we do feel that there needs to be some correction there. But there's no variability. The variability is coming from the nursing component and from the non-therapy ancillary component. That's where we are seeing some changes in capture patterns. And if we take a look at the highlights of PDPM billing, we'll start with the PTOT to see how much things are moving. And again, we're talking about care issues versus capture issues. We're not talking about phantom services that weren't there and all of a sudden were there. We're talking about services that were provided all along. Patients are sicker, but now we have the incentive and the motivation to capture and document. The argument could be made that we were underpaid for years, and now PDPM corrects that. But the major joint, the breakdown among major joint, non-orthopedic, the 4 categories in PT, OT speech, it hasn't changed all that much. Medical management is still the predominant category. Major joint hasn't moved too much. But we looked at the UBs, the Part A claims. What the MDS does not have, what the EMR does not have, are charges. How much therapy, relative therapy, each patient is receiving. So on the major joint, we see charges per day. This is from the UB04. Charges per day. Major joint does receive, the major joint patients are receiving more physical and occupational therapy, but disproportionate, or not as disproportionate to the payment level. That hasn't matched up yet quite so much. And the rate, the same thing. There's more variability among the amount of charges versus the amount of reimbursement for this component. Again, gets technical, but needs tweaking. Does not need re-engineering. I think that we need probably some tweaking on that. And the reason this is because we look back, when Medicare looked back to see how much therapy patients got, there was so much distortion with ultra high that the rates came out, well, not too much different. And as far as treatment patterns, we're not seeing that much variability in the treatment patterns for therapy. Mark, what's in terms of the overall therapy provision? I don't think a lot of those fears have been realized in terms of rationing therapy.
No, we don't think that, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, the data that we're starting to see, but we agree.
Yeah, so which is a good sign. But what, on the speech therapy component, what we have is some changes. And again, this is October 2nd admissions only. We eliminated the distortion. So none, neither. That means that a patient has no speech therapy indicators, none. No mechanically altered diet, no swallowing disorder. In October, 34% of assessments reported patients as having nothing going on with speech therapy, nothing. In December, that's down to 28%. So facilities are adapting, capturing services that were there. that were never reimbursement sensitive. The same thing with all three neither. Again, we're talking about speech therapy where we have patients that are listed as having cognitive issues, a speech therapy comorbidity, acute neurological, but no swallowing disorder or mechanically altered diet. Something that's sort of illogical. And those numbers are changing. But when we talk about relating charges on the UB, what we are actually providing and billing for speech therapy, that's where it becomes interesting. Because the neither category, patients that received or were captured as having no swallowing disorder or mechanical altered diet, we looked at the amount of charges on the UBs for the 900 facilities. So in October, 72% of those patients that had neither recorded or reported or captured had no speech therapy charges on the UB, none, which makes sense. You know, you're not capturing it, we're not capturing it if it's not there. But then we go to facilities that captured both mechanically altered diet and swallowing disorder, where you would expect more speech therapy to be provided. And that's where we saw some significant changes. Patients that were reported as having both those conditions, but no charges on the UB. So reporting speech therapy sensitive conditions without any speech therapy charges to back it up. And I think this is a learning curve. I think these are conditions that were always there or have been there for several years, but we are adapting to capturing and billing, but we're not seeing changes in acuity levels overall. On the nursing side is the big one. Special care high is what is moving the dial most of all. Special care high, respiratory therapy, IV hydration captured from the hospital, and $100 a day difference in the rate. So in October, we had 38% of special care high. Well, in October, we had 38% of the nursing scores captured in special care high. 2 months later, that's up to 46%. So when I say PDPM, in our opinion, is a solid system that requires a little bit of tweaking to bring everything into balance, there are a few tweaks, I believe, that could be made that would obviate the concern of any type of, well, capture differences that don't reflect the actual care patterns that are provided. And then on the non-therapy ancillaries, not surprising, that's changing as well. We are getting better at coding, services that were always there, but no longer there. So in October, we had 23% of assessments that captured no NTA points. They were there. Those services were there. They just weren't captured. 2 months later, that's down to 19% at 0. So we are getting better at capturing services that are there. On the C level, on the NTAC, 6 to 8, we see statistically a big jump there as well. Yep.
Quick question. Using that much of the October data might be a little misleading because in October we had all our patients in the building going into the file. So of course you weren't getting
October 2nd admissions. We did October, we get neutralized, we did, yeah, that distortion was totally neutralized. Yeah. But I was hoping nobody would pick up on that. No, I'm kidding. No, October 2nd neutralized that transition issue. The numbers with the October distortion wouldn't have made any sense. And that's what we're seeing in terms of the shift. The rates themselves on a neutralized basis are moving. They're moving up from 600, again, all neutralized. They're moving up from, take it back. We are moving up from $602, I'll find it. We are moving up from $602 to $615. Again, October neutralized. October not neutralized using the transition, it was about 615. So from October through December, we've gone from about 602 to 615. But we've got far fewer days covered. So when we look at our winners and losers, purported winners and losers, over half our winners on a rate basis, on a per diem basis, have fewer Part A covered days. It's atrophying, cannibalized by managed care, by alternative payment models. And my concern, before I turn it over here, is that incongruity cannot be evenly deployed or equally distributed throughout the country. It is not a national industry with that respect. Certain states are at a distinct disadvantage when we have huge differences in the dynamic of the factors that are pushing down utilization. And how the federal government, and I wouldn't presume to say this, but how the federal government makes calculations based on 50 different systems and 50 different outcomes is a mystery to me, especially with so fewer days. So those are the numbers I wanted to sort of go over. In the interest of time, I will switch over. Clicker.
Well, let me just make a few comments. I'm Mark Parkinson. I'm the president and CEO of the American Healthcare Association, and it's great to be here with Mark and all of you. I first want to congratulate eCap. To go from 0 to this in 3 years is impressive, and so I want to congratulate them, and we're happy to be a part of this success. I also want to start out at a very high level and say that our view is that PDPM is working. And what I mean by that is, to echo some of Mark's comments, is that first of all, CMS deserves some credit for realizing that the old system was not the best system. I'm not really prepared to completely trash the old system. My wife and I operated our buildings under our old system. I saw a ton of people get better with therapy and all that. But I will say, to Mark's point, there's more out there than just therapy. And the incentives were wrong. That the challenges that it presented to us as operators were wrong. On the one hand, we were being told to get people as well as we possibly could. On the other hand, we were being told if we gave them too much therapy, we were going to get prosecuted. And nobody could really sort of figure out the rules. So credit to CMS for figuring out that there needed to be changes, and also credit to CMS for including us in the process. When they started out 5 or 6 years ago with the original iteration of the resident classification system, it was a bad system. It wouldn't have worked for us. It wouldn't have worked for our patients. But they listened. They included us in their technical expertise panels. They included our input. They made a lot of changes that we suggested. And so I give them credit, number one, for coming up with the system. I give them credit, number two, for rolling it out effectively. There are like 1,000 things that could have gone wrong with this system. I mean, there are a lot of moving parts, as you all know, from operationalizing it. And there have been some pretty famous disasters in rolling out new systems. There were glitches in the very early days post-October 1, but CMS fixed them all. They put the right teams in place to get the whole thing going. And so credit to CMS for all of that. I also want to give a plug to Mark. You know, about 3 or 4 years ago, I was coming around to the notion that this new model, which it actually wasn't called PDPM at that time, but that the new model could work for us. I was kind of a lone voice with that view, but Mark also had that view and gave me sort of the backbone to say to our board and to others, hey, we need to quit being afraid of this thing. This could actually be a good thing for us, and I think that generally it has been. What I'm going to talk about in this short time is, number one, has it been too good? What are the results that we have seen? Number two, what is the probable response from CMS? And then finally, if we have some time, I want to make sure that you're aware of a couple of Medicaid issues that I do think are material to your operations. I've got a ton of slides. I'm not going to show very many of them. I'm just going to start out, first of all, with the question of what has been our experience. And there are three critical metrics that have to be evaluated to determine how this has gone and what CMS's reaction will be. First and most important are outcomes. Is the system good for residents? Are the residents doing as well or hopefully better than under the old RUG system? And the bottom line answer is we don't know. It's too early, that there's a lag in getting enough data sets to really know. But I will tell you that anecdotally, and all of you know from your own experience in your buildings, it appears that PDPM is working for the residents. We'll know a lot more later on, and if it's working really well, if the key outcomes like return to community and return to hospital are better, it's going to make it a lot easier to defend the system itself. So first and foremost critical issue is how is it for the residents, and the bottom line answer is anecdotally we think it's good. From a data perspective, we don't know yet. Second question, what is it on the revenue side? You know, for a couple of years, people have been speculating, you know, how will I do under PDPM? What will my rate be compared to RUGs? And then since October 1, obviously, we've been peppered with tons and tons of questions about what's happening on the revenue side. First of all, Mark's given us fantastic data. So he's got a data set of 1,200 buildings that gives you the exact analysis of what's happening in those buildings. When you think about how you're doing with PDPM, you have to also factor in that we were supposed to get a 2.4% market basket increase anyway. So the issue is, how are you doing relative to your old rate plus 2.4? We're now starting to get some hard data because the publicly traded companies are having to report. And so 2 weeks ago, Ensign reported, and what Ensign reported was that in their buildings that they had owned for less than a couple of years, their increase was about 3% above the 2.4. And in the buildings that they had owned for more than 2 years, their increase was 6% above the 2.4. And they didn't really give a blended rate, but if you go through the financials, it looks like their blended rate would be somewhere in the mid-4s above the 2.4%. That's pretty consistent with many, many discussions that I've had with CEOs and CFOs across the country. That's sort of what they are seeing. Omega announced also a couple of weeks ago, Omega announced without getting any specific numbers that their tenants are seeing small increases above budget neutrality. NHC will be reporting here in the next week or so. Genesis will be reporting, I believe, in March. And once we have that, we'll have a pretty good data set of a pretty representative groups of buildings across the country. My view is that we have seen what I've defined as a modest increase above budget neutrality. It's not budget neutral, but it's also not 2011. For those of you that were around in 2011, I know that's most of us, there was a change in the RUG system where we saw a dramatic increase in our rates. It was supposed to be budget neutral, but instead it was about 12.7% above budget neutral. That's not where we're at right now. We're at some level between what CMS would define as budget neutrality and where we were in 2011, and I think, you know, somewhere in the middle ground there is probably where we're at. The third question is on the cost side. And this is where I was wrong, and I think actually pleasantly surprised. Because what's happened is more defensible. I would have accepted what I thought was going to happen, but what's happened instead, I think it's more defensible at CMS. And what has happened on the cost side is that providers in general have very slowly and deliberately changed their therapy practices. I thought that on October 1, once the switch turned, that we would go to group and concurrent at almost 25% overnight. And the reason that I thought that was that when CMS got rid of allowing us to bill for everyone in front of us with group and concurrent back in 2011, we went from 27% to 1% in the course of 30 days. I thought the same thing would happen in reverse. Again, we don't have great data sets, but from talking with many CEOs across the country, it doesn't sound like that's happened.
And that data backs.
Yeah, it sounded like
exactly.
It's more like 10%, 15%. What's your number? Like 12 or?
That's 12 to 15, yeah,
Yeah,
maybe.
yeah.
But that's between medical, that's major joint and the lowest.
Right.
So it's
And CMS loves that, because all the folks that were out there that were saying we were going to fire thousands of therapists overnight, we were going to put everybody in a group and concurrent, that just ended up to not be the case. The other thing that appears is not the case is it doesn't appear that there is a dramatic drop in therapy minutes. People have been very conservative to change their therapy practices, so our critics who predicted that overnight there would be, a 25 or 30 or 40 or 50% drop in minutes have just proven to be wrong. That becomes very, very important when we think about how CMS might respond to this. So let me tell you how I think our current thinking, our lobbyists' thinking, our consultants' thinking is in terms of what's going to happen as CMS's response to PDPM. First, let me talk about the revenue side. On the revenue side, it is hard for CMS to react in a very, very quick way. Our annual payment rule comes out right before May 1 of every year. So roughly 10 weeks from this Friday, we are expecting our payment rule that will dictate our payments starting on October 1 of 2020 through October 1 of 2021. The first opportunity that CMS would have to recalibrate based upon what's happened since October 1 would be in that May 1 rule. I'm going to go through these slides really quickly just to show you how tough it would be for them to do that. So this is the schedule that CMS uses to come up with our annual payment rule. Over on the left, they finalized the prior year's rule on August 1, and that's when we really start lobbying for the next year's rule. But by the time period that we're in right now, the January to May time period, the rule's already been written. It's not like they wait until May 1 and try to figure out what her increase will be and then try to work it through all the process. There's a bureaucracy and there's an approval process and there's a bunch of agencies that have to look at it. Our rule has already been written. It's working its way through the bureaucracy right now and will ultimately come out on May 1. That doesn't mean that they can't make changes by May 1. Back in 2011, they got their act together and they were able to make these changes before May 1, but it does mean that they're only likely to do that if they feel that there is compelling evidence that they need to act in a rational way to act. In our discussions with CMS is being very thoughtful about this and saying, hey, look, this is a completely new system. There's a lot of moving parts. There are a lot of changes that are out there, and we really want to have full data sets before we make any statements about how we think it's going on the revenue or cost side, or before we consider any changes. And I don't think that CMS has, or we have, enough information now to currently act. Now, there is a very conservative group within the administration called the Office of Management and Budget that has to approve every rule that goes through. And it's very possible that as our payment rule works its way through the process, that OMB might say, hey, looks like they're making a little extra money, maybe we should do something about that. But to Mark's point, it would be very hard to know right now what the rational thing to do is. I mean, we need to learn more about where the cost drivers are in this thing so we can figure out what we need to do. So first opportunity would be May 1. We're actively encouraging them to not act on May 1, to be more thoughtful and wait until they get more data, but that would be their first opportunity. Their second opportunity is not to wait a year. Their second opportunity would be to get data and then issue an interim payment rule, which doesn't happen very often, but it can happen. And it would be possible in this case where maybe in the summer or the fall of 2020, they say, now we have data. If Mark's evidence continues, if the rates keep going up at some point, there will be a compelling case on their part to maybe do something after the rule on May 1. And that's a possibility. And then the third and probably most likely scenario would be that they would wait until May 1 of 2021 to make a recalibration that would then be more thoughtful based upon more data, and they would go into effect after that. There's always a question of whether they claw money back that's been paid, and the answer is that usually they don't. We were successful back in 2011 of them not clawing back what was a pretty significant amount of money. So we'll fight that, but I don't think that's an enormous risk. And then there's also the possibility, and I don't want to inflate hopes here, But there is the possibility that even if we have an increase, that we can defend some of it. Now, that is a very, very tough battle because CMS's directive was to be budget neutral. And so I know that all of us will feel like, oh, we're finally getting paid for what we've been doing in the past. They shouldn't take this money away. That will be a tough argument. But if we can demonstrate that we're taking care of new types of folks, that because we're being paid and reimbursed for all sorts of new services, that we're taking care of a different kind of patient, and in particular, if we have a really compelling argument on outcomes, if outcomes are very, very good, that would increase the probability of being able to hold on to something beyond budget neutral. And then the final thing that I'll talk about is on the cost side. I think the sector has responded so responsibly on the cost side that I'm not overly worried that they will make adjustments on that side. I don't think they're going to impose minute requirements like under the old system or take away the group and concurrent rules because, again, people have done this, at least we believe, in a very responsible, methodical fashion. If you are a provider that overnight dropped your minutes 50%, thinking that everybody else was going to do that, I think you're going to be sticking out like a sore thumb because I don't think a lot of other people did that, and you're really going to need to sort of think through your strategy. On the Medicaid side, there are some rules that are out there that are important. I just want to say quickly, the block grant thing is not a problem. We were able to get carved out of it. It's not an issue. They've carved out the elderly and disabled. The MFAR rule, which impacts provider assessments, and then the IGTs in Indiana, Utah, and Texas, is a real issue. It is something that we need to be concerned about. We're all over it, but if you have buildings, particularly in those 3 states, you need to be on top of exactly what's happening with that rule and what all of the activities are. But in general, I would say PDPM is off to a good start, and hopefully we can hold on to it.
My concern with the president's 2021 budget is the bad debt, the reimbursable bad debt. And it gets technical on the cost reporting side, but the rules, again, are so different from state to state, where they 21 through 100, New York Medicaid will pay 100%. Yeah. That's going to go down to 25% in a state like New Jersey. Right. That is a $130 a day difference for 80 days for the same patient. Right. And that's what disturbs me more than anything about, again, federal policy being superimposed on state conditions that are just so different.
And Mark's right. The president issued a budget. It had a bunch of things that would be bad for it. It actually had 2 things for us that would be good for us in the budget. But none of the budget's going to be adopted because the Ds have the House, the Rs have the Senate. Nothing's going to happen on the budget. So I know you're out there, you're running your business, you're running your buildings, and you see these headlines about block grants or bad debt reductions or the good things in the budget, and you think this stuff's going to happen. It's not going to happen. Congress can barely pass the legislation to keep the government running. They're not going to be able to pass any of this other stuff. Now, if we end up with one party having everything, let's say that the Ds nominate Bernie Sanders and the predictions are that if Bernie gets nominated, the Rs win everything, then we're going to have a Medicaid issue big time on our hands. They will want to do block grants again. They'll want to do the MFAR stuff through statute. If the Ds win everything, there's going to be all sorts of regulatory stuff and minimum staffing and tort and all that. So we need divided government. And as long as we have divided government, I think we'll be okay.
In a tort, we do a lot of litigation support. A few slides ago, I had 2 headlines from the New York Times. One, pre-PDPM, rehabbing patients to death. The other one, rationing. Yeah. So everything, it's just a different perspective. And I've spoken to a couple of you talk about tort reform. I've spoken to a couple of people I know, I won't call them friends, that are in the business of suing nursing homes, and they are waiting for patients to suffer once they get discharged for rationing. The argument being that they got 2 hours last year, they got 45 minutes a day this year, and they weren't ready to go home. So the exposure, the ripple effects of PDPM and any of those changes have severe, have to be considered. We're going to see surprises come up regardless.
I think if we would have had a 50% reduction in therapy minutes and everybody went to 25% group and concurrent, those cases would have real merit. But at a 10, 15% group and concurrent rate, overall therapy minutes dropping 10 or 15%, I think those cases would be
That was the
pretty
most
comfortable.
pleasant surprise in looking at our data. Was I was expecting a huge difference among the different categories. A huge difference between major joint and medical management. And we didn't see it.
We've got a few minutes. Should we see if there's any questions?
Yeah, definitely.
We've got like 3 minutes. If anybody has any questions. Yeah, John.
MedPAC speak out and catch wind of any of this, and will that affect
Yeah.
the act increase still?
Right. That's a great question. MedPAC measures our Medicare margins every year. And so they're going to be required to measure our Medicare margins for this year. That won't happen for a year or two because of the lag. But if all of a sudden we go from what they view as like a 10% margin to like a 17% margin, they're going to raise a lot of issues about that. Now, we have been successful for the last 8 years at beating down their recommendation that CMS doesn't give us our market basket increase. So just because MedPAC gets alarmed about something doesn't mean that we're going to lose an issue. But you're right. We've got to prepare ourselves for a report in about a year and a half that our margin's gone up.
But again, a state with all the alternative payment models and managed care,
Yeah,
it just simply doesn't matter as much
right.
versus another one. So just a structural inconsistency that is getting more severe.
The problem is the number that gets the most attention is our Med-A margin that they report. Now, they do report our all-in margin, which is terrible, but the press focuses in on that Med-A margin, which will go up.
Do you think, in your opinion, do you think forget PDPM, that the entire revenue delivery system on a national basis needs to be overhauled is a good word. It'll help some states, it'll hurt others. I hate to use the word redistribution, but
Yeah, so an argument, a policy argument that's been made for a long time is that Medicaid should be federalized so that there's a consistent rate across the country. It's not going to happen.
or
There's a variety
Medicare
of reasons.
Advantage.
I mean, you can have the academic argument, but it's just not going to happen.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen because the federal government doesn't want to take on the debt. It doesn't want to happen because a bunch of you wouldn't want it to happen. I mean, if you have buildings in Oregon or Alaska or Hawaii or Maryland or, there's a number of states where you wouldn't suddenly want to have Texas's Medicaid rate.